Okay, so I'm going to take you through chapter 5 in Bram Stoker's Dracula. And here we've got Lucy writing letters to Mina and recounting the day when she had 3 marriage proposals. And the first one was from John Stewart, the second one is from Quincy Morris, and then the third one is from Arthur, whom she decides she's going to marry. And Stoker does seem to set up Lucy and Mina as versions of the new woman. If you remember Gwendolen from Importance of Being Earnest, that kind of new woman who, has a bit of kind of sexual desire, is quite flirtatious, has a mind of her own and so on. And we've got a little bit of that going on with Lucy and Mina. So there's no doubt, I think, that Stoker was perhaps using those characters to kind of, reflect the changing times. But generally, I think, we would probably come to the conclusion that he mostly fails to challenge any gender norms with, particularly with Lucy's character. Anyway, we're focusing on Lucy today. So let's just have a look at this, this chapter. You might want to pause the video at this particular moment and find the letter in chapter 5 that begins, "My dearest Mina, thanks and thanks and thanks again for your sweet letter." If you can just reread this letter now for a minute, pause the video. Okay, so let's just go through this and see what Stoker's doing here with her character. So she says, "Just fancy, 3 proposals in one day. Isn't it awful? Don't tell any of the girls or they would be getting all kinds of extravagant ideas." This would have shocked contemporary readers. 3 proposals in one day. Very, very much contrasting the Victorian ideal of female virtue. I guess if you get 3 proposals in one day, you're probably the kind of character that might have encouraged that, which of course would have been frowned upon. And there was also some kind of rather narrow concerns. This sort of don't tell any of the girls, sort of gossipy, talking about boys and proposals, etc., etc. And it generally kind of the narrow concerns of women here are explored. Women very much remaining in the domestic sphere, and the contents of Mina's letters are pretty rambling as well, in terms of the way that they're structured, which kind of create this idea of maybe a bit of a dizzy, scatty kind of character, which perhaps reinforces gender norms as well. Let's have a look at this. "A woman ought to tell her husband everything, don't you think so, dear? Mina, dear, you and I, who are engaged, are going to settle down soberly into married women, can despise vanity." So very much kind of, there's a bit of a moral kind of framework to this. The way that she comes across as being sort of concerned about how she might be perceived, and yet she's still rather coquettish. But yeah, definitely there's some reinforcing of gender norms going on here. "Oh, Mina dear, I can't help crying. You must excuse this letter all being blotted," and so on. And again later here, "I suppose that we women are such cowards that we think a man will save us from fears," and so on. Oh, and that's another point as well. Essentially, that's what happens to Lucy's character. That's what happens to her. She is, they're sort of rescued by the 3 men who propose to her. Eventually, at the end of the novel, they sort of save her soul by killing her, and she becomes the pure Lucy again, pure wholesome Lucy again, once she's had a stake driven through her heart. Let's have a look at the second page here. She comes across as quite coquettish, really. She says, I know, Mina, you will think me a horrid flirt, though I cannot help feeling a sort of exultation. So, Lucy doesn't really match up to Mina's higher moral status, who is never anything like this. But yeah, there's a little kind of flirtatiousness about her character that seems to be, I would have shocked a Victorian audience, a Victorian reader. And I guess we might even say that she's punished for it. She gets a comeuppance. Women who think like this, it never ends well for them. So perhaps there might even be a warning to Victorian women in the character of Lucy, and really ultimately what happens to her fate. Here again, my dear Mina, why are men so noble when we women are so little worthy of them? My God. Of course, this is Stoker clearly talking through the character of Lucy, definitely reinforcing gender norms there. Women as kind of essentially weak and helpless. And then later on she says, why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble? So really quite a shocking hint there of polygamy. There's more than a hint of female desire here, which of course is a taboo as well. This is quickly, this idea is quickly condemned by, but this is heresy, and I must not say it. So very much the typical moral framework in a Gothic novel. But definitely we've got Stoker here exploring female desire, which is definitely progressive. I guess it's a progressive idea. It's sort of fairly taboo. But ultimately what happens to her is, if you're this kind of a woman, you might succumb to the influence of someone like the Count, and therefore, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to have these feelings. So definitely a moral framework going on here. And then look at this. Lucy explains that even though she turns Quincy Morris down, she leans over and kisses him. And it might seem perfectly innocent for a woman to do that nowadays. She kisses, in fact, when we read on, we find that she kisses 2 men in one day. That might seem perfectly normal in our day. But in the Victorian era, this would have been really quite shocking and, very unusual, sexually liberated way of of behaving. And so she's definitely a rather coquettish, sort of flirty character, flighty, a bit silly, a bit helpless. So we've got lots of that going on with her character. And then again, a reference to her crying, and I'm crying like a baby. Again, reinforcing gender norms as sort of women as weak and essentially helpless, and really have to be rescued by men. And of course, that's what happens when Arthur and Quincy and Stewart, they all kind of ultimately they rescue her in the end. So what about Lucy's character? Is she a developed character? Well, she's not really very well rounded, is she? She seems a fairly sort of two-dimensional figure. The epistolary narrative format, that means letter writing, allows Stoker to develop her character because we hear what's going on in her head. She's not a fully developed character, and so you might want to have something to say about that. And again, I've already touched upon this, but Lucy's fate is central to the novel's plot. This idea that a woman can be under threat of violence or corruption, that's a common theme in Gothic literature. And Lucy represents purity and goodness, and the Count represents corruption and evil, which is sort of typical in Gothic fiction, that battle between good and evil. And good, of course, will always conquer evil. But it's the journey that's a thrilling one. That's the fun bit. that battle that goes on in a person's, character between good and evil. So that kind of situation of kind of, potential corruption there, being kind of drawn towards the evil count, and the way Lucy is, it allows writers to explore secret desires and hidden passions and taboo ideas. And that male fantasy of sexual domination, if you remember, towards the end of the novel, Lucy, just before the men drive a stake into her heart, Lucy says, "Come to me, Arthur." And, she's quite sort of voluptuousness is described, and the fact that, Arthur nearly succumbs to her. That kind of male fantasy of sexual domination. Now we see that in Lucy's character just before she dies in that final scene, and of course we see that in those 3 sex-craved vampiresses that I refer to in the other video, representing really what happens to women when they succumb to sin and are corrupted by evil. So there's a moral warning there in this message as well. Okay, so lots to think about for the character of Lucy.